In the vast expanse of the galaxy, humanity had grown accustomed to peace for over a century. The colonies expanded steadily from one planet to the next, their reach stretching further and further into the unknown. This new era was one of prosperity, no longer plagued by the wars of old humanity, now wielded advanced technology that made them masters of their world, and the stars they inhabited, even the most hostile of environments, seemed tame when faced with the ingenuity of mankind. Yet beneath the surface of this peace, strange things were happening. In the farthest corners of human space, isolated colonies began to report strange occurrences. At first, the messages were dismissed as glitches or technical failures, but as the reports grew more frequent, they could no longer be ignored. Ships lost without a trace, outposts simply vanishing from the records, entire settlements left empty with no signs of struggle or distress. In the outer reaches of the galaxy, far from the bustling heart of human civilization, the first signs of something more sinister began to show. A small research station called Telris 5, located on a barren moon, went silent for 3 weeks. When the station's automated systems finally rebooted, the recorded footage from the cameras showed no evidence of a struggle, no signs of invasion or attack. Yet the personnel were gone entirely. Not a single trace remained of them. Nothing in the data logs suggested what had occurred. The next report came from a nearby military outpost stationed along the trade route between 2 human colonies. The crew there had been on alert for weeks. Due to the growing tensions in the region, their mission was simple: ensure safe passage for the civilian ships passing through the area. But when the patrol ships were sent out to check on an anomaly in the region, they never returned. At first, officials assumed some natural cause had taken hold, perhaps some unexplained phenomenon in the space around them. But as more incidents accumulated, it became clear something or someone was causing the disappearances. There were no obvious enemies in the area, no pirate factions or hostile species. They had been on high alert for any sign of attack, yet nothing could explain these events. The fear began to creep into the highest levels of the military. The disappearances were becoming too frequent to ignore. An emergency session was called in the human capital, where the top military leaders and officials gathered in a secure chamber. The meeting was filled with urgency. The evidence was overwhelming and unsettling. Whatever was happening out there was unlike anything they had encountered before. There was no logic to it, no pattern to the disappearances. They seemed random yet deliberate. One voice among the crowd of officials stood out. An older general known for his quiet demeanor spoke up, though his words were laced with a cold seriousness that made everyone listen. He spoke of a dark time from long ago, a time when humanity was still in the early stages of its expansion, when there was a species so terrifying it had made the entire galaxy unite in an effort to erase them from existence. But as he began to speak of them, he hesitated and then stopped mid-sentence, his eyes scanning the room as if fearing the very words he had just uttered. The others watched him in silence, unsure of what he meant, but one thing was clear: humanity was facing a threat they didn't understand, one that had been buried so deep in history that no one dared speak its name for fear of what it could mean for their future. The room fell into an uneasy silence after the general's ominous words, his gaze lingering on the faces of the gathered officials, as if daring someone to ask more questions. But no one spoke. The fear of the unknown hung thick in the air. Finally, after a long pause, one of the younger commanders cleared his throat, breaking the tension. "General, what do you mean by this species? What are you talking about?" he asked cautiously. The general didn't answer immediately, his eyes distant, as if recalling something buried deep in his memory. It was clear whatever he was about to reveal would not be easy, but the room's tension was palpable. The others leaned forward as he slowly began to speak once again. "I don't know how much you've been told about the early days of our expansion, but there was a time when humanity faced threats far worse than anything we've ever seen since." He paused again, as if weighing his words carefully. One of those threats was known as the Rageborn. The name struck like a thunderclap. The room buzzed with confusion and disbelief as everyone exchanged looks. None of them had ever heard that name before. It wasn't in any official record, nor in any of the histories humanity had kept from their dark past. "Rageborn," another officer repeated softly, as if testing the word as it sat heavy in the air. "They were a species unlike anything we had ever encountered. The general continued, his voice low and deliberate. Their biology was unique. It's hard to describe what exactly made them so dangerous, but there was one thing that set them apart from all others. He paused again, as if the weight of the memory was too much to bear. Their mere presence could trigger overwhelming rage in any sentient being nearby. The room stirred as the officials tried to process this revelation. Some exchanged glances, while others frowned in disbelief. "Are you saying they could control our emotions?" one asked skeptically. "Not control," the general replied, "but amplified. They could induce an uncontrollable fury in anyone who came near them. It wasn't just anger. It was a primal instinct, something deep within the psyche that could turn a peaceful person into a violent one in seconds." The commander who had asked the question earlier looked uneasy. "And what happened to them? Why haven't we heard of them before?" "They were defeated," the general answered flatly. "But not by force, not in the traditional sense." He seemed to be choosing his words carefully now. "A coalition of species came together to isolate them and eventually drive them into hiding." "Isolate them how?" someone asked. The general shook his head. "I don't know all the details. I wasn't there. But what I do know is that the Rageborn were pushed to the very edge of the galaxy and then erased from history. They were sealed away in such a way that no one would ever speak of them again. The records were destroyed, and the memories of those who fought against them were wiped clean." "But if they were truly erased," another officer interrupted, "then how are they related to these disappearances?" The general's face grew darker, his eyes narrowing. "I think they've come back, and something has awakened them. We don't know how or why, but it's no coincidence that the disappearances are happening now." He looked around the room, meeting the eyes of each officer. "Whatever we do next, we need to act fast, because the Rageborn aren't just a threat to us, they're a threat to everything we've built." A heavy silence descended upon the room as the weight of his words settled in. The officials knew this was no longer just a matter of missing ships or lost stations. Humanity's greatest nightmare had returned, and they had no idea how to stop it. In the days following the emergency meeting, the atmosphere in the human capital grew tense. Even the air seemed thicker, as if the very atmosphere was suffocating under the weight of what they had learned. The higher-ups within the military began to mobilize every available resource under the guise of a routine investigation. But it was clear to everyone involved this was anything but routine. At the heart of the military command center, Helena Rook, a historian specializing in ancient warfare, found herself increasingly drawn into the crisis. Despite her initial reluctance to get involved, she had been approached by a senior officer who had known her work on the origins of past conflicts. Her expertise was needed on this mysterious species, the Rageborn. Dr. Rook had always been cautious about diving too deep into the darker parts of history, especially those areas that had been deliberately erased from the official record. But the more she read about the Rageborn, the more unsettled she became. Something about their return felt wrong, and the general's warnings about their existence had struck a chord with her. After days of research deep within the archives of the military's hidden vaults, Dr. Rook stumbled upon something she hadn't expected to find: a collection of old, encrypted records buried deep within the digital files, the kind of files that hadn't been accessed in centuries. They were outdated, but they told a story that matched the general's description far too closely. The Rageborn hadn't simply been driven into hiding. They had been sealed away by a coalition of species that had once formed an uneasy alliance to rid the galaxy of them. But their efforts had left something behind, a lingering presence that could not be erased. Not entirely. In those records, Dr. Rook found references to a location, something that had been kept from the public records for so long that no one alive today could remember its existence. The coordinates were buried within the oldest maps of the galaxy, far beyond the known reaches of human space, hidden in a place where no one would think to look. But as Dr. Rook carefully pieced together the fragmented data, it became clear to her that the Rageborn had never been entirely vanquished. They had merely been contained, waiting for the right moment to reemerge. One night, driven by an insatiable need for answers, Rook took the information she had uncovered and presented it to the military. She knew there was no turning back now, but the decision to act on this knowledge wasn't easy. The higher-ups were divided. Many saw the data as nothing more than the remnants of a long-forgotten myth, while others felt a cold dread creep over them at the possibility that the Rageborn might truly be alive. Dr. Rook, are you telling us that these creatures are still out there somewhere? The Admiral asked, his voice low, as if afraid to speak the words out loud. They're not just out there, she replied with urgency. They're still alive, and they've been waiting this whole time. She spread the maps across the table before them, showing the forgotten coordinates of the sealed-away world where the Rageborn were believed to reside. This is where they're hiding. We need to go there. We need to find out how they survived, and whether they've awakened. The room was silent for a moment before one of the officers stood up. And what do you expect us to find there, Dar Rook? She met his gaze with unwavering certainty. I don't know yet, but I do know this. We are not the only ones who've forgotten them. And if we don't act soon, we might not be able to stop them before it's too late. With a single decisive look, the Admiral nodded, signaling the decision was made. Prepare. A team will launch a mission to the coordinates you've provided. As the room began to mobilize for the mission, Dr. Rook couldn't shake the growing feeling in her gut. The Rageborn weren't just a threat to the colonies and military outposts. They were a threat to something deeper, something about humanity itself. The mission to the Forgotten Planet began in secrecy, with only a handful of senior officers and key scientists aware of the full scope of what they were about to confront. A specially selected team was assembled. Their task simple on paper: investigate the anomaly in the distant coordinates and return with information. However, no one aboard the ship was under any illusion about the true nature of the mission. The fear of the unknown clung to them, all like a shadow. Helena Rook was among those chosen to accompany the team, not only for her expertise, but because she was the only one who seemed to understand the gravity of the situation. She had spent countless nights reading the old records and piecing together fragmented clues that hinted at something far worse than anyone could truly comprehend. The Rageborn were not just a relic of history. They were a living, breathing threat. The journey to the coordinates was uneventful at first. The sleek, advanced ship glided through the stars, carrying its passengers away from the relative safety of human space and into the vast unknown. For hours, the crew worked in silence, exchanging only the occasional glance as the weight of the mission settled over them. It wasn't just fear of the unknown that plagued them. It was the fear of what they might find, and what they might have to do. Dar Rook sat at her terminal, reviewing the ancient data again, trying to find any hint of how to deal with the Rageborn. If they were indeed still alive, the records were cryptic at best, and the more she read, the more she realized how little was known about the species that had so terrified the galaxy. She couldn't help but wonder how humanity had managed to defeat them in the past, or if defeat was even the right word for what had occurred. As they approached the planet's outer orbit, the crew began to feel it. The subtle shift in the atmosphere, as though something was pressing in from all sides. The temperature aboard the ship seemed to drop by several degrees, and the crew's nerves began to fray. There was a tension, a barely perceptible hum in the air, as if the very fabric of space itself had grown taut and ready to snap. Then, as the ship entered the atmosphere, it happened. It started small, a shift in mood, an unexplainable urge to snap at each other, to lash out without reason. At first, it was subtle. A crew member raised his voice over a minor issue. Another shot back, a harsh retort, but soon the tension began to build. Every word, every look, every gesture seemed to add fuel to an invisible fire. That fire spread quickly, igniting the crew's emotions in a way that felt unnatural. Dar Rook felt it too. Her heart began to race, her hands shaking as an anger she could not explain welled up inside her. She was used to the pressure of high-stakes situations, but this was different. This wasn't fear or frustration. It was something primal, something deep within her that screamed for violence, something ancient. "Stay calm," she muttered to herself, her voice barely audible as she stood up from her seat. The rage was growing, spreading like a virus among the crew. But it wasn't just the crew. She could feel it in the very air, the presence of something ancient and terrible, pushing them, pulling them. Dr. Rook, what the hell is happening? A voice shouted from across the room, breaking her trance. She looked around, her thoughts momentarily fogged as the crew became more agitated, more volatile. The ship was beginning to feel claustrophobic, as if the walls were closing in on them. She knew then. This was what the Rageborn had done to the galaxy. They had awakened something inside them all. It wasn't the Rageborn that was causing the outbreak of aggression. It was the proximity to them. The presence of the species' dormant energy that was beginning to seep through the very atmosphere of the planet. They hadn't even landed yet, and already the crew was losing control. The ship began to shake as turbulence rattled them. And for a moment, Dr. Rook lost her footing. She felt an overwhelming urge to lash out at the nearest crew member, to punch them, to scream. She fought to control the sensation, but it was like a wave crashing over her mind, threatening to drown her in a tide of violent impulses. Focus, she thought, her voice trembling in her mind. She had to hold it together. They all had to. The ship's automated systems announced their descent, but the words barely registered in her mind as she steadied herself, trying to push the rage back down. But deep within her, something else stirred, something that didn't belong to her or to humanity. It was old, it was furious. And it was waiting. As the ship descended toward the planet's surface, Dr. Rook could feel the tension in the air thickening with each passing moment. The rage that had been building in the crew was reaching a fever pitch. It wasn't just the anger anymore. It was something worse, something primal, almost contagious. As they neared the surface, the crew's behavior became increasingly erratic. They snapped at each other over the smallest things, their voices rising, eyes flashing with aggression. "Settle down," Dr. Rook barked, trying to maintain control as she moved through the cramped corridors of the ship. But even she could feel the gnawing urge to snap, to lash out, tugging at her every thought. She had never experienced anything like this. Not even during the wars humanity had fought in the past. Nothing had ever felt so immediate, so violent. The ship broke through the dense clouds, and the barren landscape below came into view. Gray, desolate, with jagged mountains and vast stretches of cracked earth. It looked uninhabited, lifeless, as if the planet itself had been forgotten by time. But Dr. Rook knew better. The planet was anything but dead. Their landing was rough, a result of the increasing turbulence from the growing unrest aboard the ship, but the ship's landing thrusters managed to keep them stable enough to touch down without major damage. As the ramp lowered, the team quickly disembarked, their gear heavy and clanking as they trudged across the rocky, lifeless terrain. The air was thick and cold, the ground beneath their boots unstable, and yet there was an almost eerie stillness, as though the planet was waiting. They moved forward cautiously, their senses heightened, aware of the invisible weight that pressed down on them. Daruk's heart pounded in her chest. She could feel the rage swirling inside her again, pulling at her sanity, urging her to let go, to embrace the violent impulse gnawing at the edges of her thoughts. She fought it with every ounce of willpower she had, but the harder she fought, the more insistent the pull became. It was as if the planet itself was amplifying their darkest emotions, feeding on their anger. "Stay focused," she whispered to herself as she looked at the other members of the team. They were all struggling, some already breaking down, shouting at one another over trivial matters. Others were silently seething, their faces twisted in quiet fury. The team pressed forward, climbing over rocky outcroppings toward the center of the planet's ruined landscape. The ruins of an ancient civilization stood before them, stone structures twisted and broken, like the remnants of a forgotten empire. These were the ruins of the Rageborn. Dr. Rook realized, the ancient remnants of their home world, hidden away from the galaxy for eons. As they ventured deeper into the ruins, the effects of the planet's influence on them grew stronger. Every step forward seemed to push them further into a state of heightened aggression. Dr. Rook's thoughts were clouded, the rage growing inside her, until she could barely keep her focus. Her breath came in short gasps, and her hands trembled uncontrollably. She had never been one to lose control like this. And then they saw it at the heart of the ruins stood a massive structure, an ancient temple of sorts, its dark stone facade scarred by time and weather. But what caught Dr. Rook's attention was the strange energy emanating from it. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there, a pulse of dark energy that seemed to resonate with the very air itself. "Do you feel that?" one of the officers asked, his voice low and tense. Dr. Rook nodded, her own voice barely a whisper. "It's them." The crew continued to move forward, but the closer they got to the structure, the more unbearable the pull of the rage became. Some of the officers began to argue, shouting over each other, each one trying to assert dominance over the others. A fight was about to break out, but Dr. Rook stepped forward, her voice rising above the chaos. "We have to control ourselves," she commanded, her voice sharp but shaking. "This is what they want. This is what the Rageborn do to you." But the words barely reached them. The Rageborn's influence was already seeping into their minds, twisting their emotions until logic and reason had no place to stand. Dr. Rook knew then that they weren't just dealing with an ancient species, they were dealing with something far more dangerous. A force that could twist the very core of sentient beings into violent chaos. The Rageborn were not merely creatures. They were an infection, and they had been dormant for far too long. As they neared the entrance of the temple, the air around them began to hum with energy, the ground beneath their feet vibrating as the doors of the temple slowly began to open. Dr. Rook felt a cold, unyielding presence beckoning her inside, and despite every ounce of resistance in her body, despite the growing terror and rage that clawed at her soul, she stepped forward. The Rageborn had awakened, and humanity's worst fear had come to life. The doors of the ancient temple creaked open with an eerie groan, revealing an interior cloaked in darkness. The moment they stepped inside, the oppressive air thickened, pressing against their lungs, as though the very walls were alive. Watching them, the atmosphere was heavy, the air dense with an ancient power that seemed to twist the very fabric of reality around them. The ground beneath their boots was cold, slick with some substance that neither looked nor felt natural, and the faint hum of energy pulsed through the structure like a heartbeat. Dr. Rook's breath hitched as she felt the anger inside her flare again. It wasn't just a physical reaction anymore. It was like something had dug its claws deep into her psyche, pulling at her thoughts, making them race toward violence, toward destruction. She struggled to keep control, but the weight of it was overwhelming. She had to keep her focus. She had to understand what was happening here before it was too late. "Stay alert," she snapped to the rest of the team, her voice strained with the effort to keep calm. But her words barely registered as the crew shuffled nervously, the effects of the planet's influence taking hold of them. One officer, barely able to maintain his composure, muttered to himself, "I don't like this, I just want to get out of here." He looked around wildly, his face flushed with rising anger. Before Dr. Rook could respond, another officer lunged at him, shouting a sharp, incoherent insult. The others watched in stunned silence as the two soldiers collided, grappling and punching each other, their emotions completely unchecked as their physical struggle turned violent. Dr. Rook could feel the pull in her chest, the urge to join in, to throw herself into the fight. "No," she gasped, her voice trembling, as she forced herself to step between them, pulling them apart. "This is what they want. You see it now. This is the Rageborn's power. It's not just them. It's the planet itself." But it was too late. The rage had taken root in their minds, and the only thing left was to feed it. Dr. Rook's heart pounded in her chest as she grabbed the nearest soldier and shoved him back from the fight. "Focus, we have to focus." Her words barely made a dent in the chaos around her. The team had broken into two factions, one half shouting at the other, the rest gripped by violent impulses as they pushed, shoved, and threatened one another. The anger in the room was tangible, a feverish storm that seemed to build with every passing second. The hum in the air grew louder, vibrating through the stone walls, amplifying the chaos within them. It was as though the planet itself was feeding off their fury, growing stronger with each burst of aggression. The very space around them was warping, the lines between reality and madness blurring as the Rageborn's influence reached out and consumed their minds. Daruk stumbled back, clutching her head. Feeling her control slipping, she could feel the Rageborn's presence now, not just as an abstract concept, but as something real, something tangible, something hungry. The energy was like a torrent of emotion crashing through her psyche, turning every thought into a spark of violent energy ready to explode. In that moment, the team's struggle grew even more frantic, as if their aggression had reached a tipping point suddenly. A voice cut through the madness, a voice cold and hollow, reverberating from somewhere deep within the temple. "Leave this place," the voice intoned, sending chills down Daruk's spine. It wasn't human. It wasn't even close, but it was clear. It was the Rageborn, and it was awake. The crew fell silent, all of them turning toward the source of the voice that echoed through the ancient chamber. The walls seemed to pulse with energy, the stone growing darker, as though the very building was alive, feeding on their anger, their hatred. Daruk's heart raced. She couldn't afford to lose control now. If the Rageborn could feel their emotions, if their anger was feeding the very force they had come to confront, then they had already lost. "We have to stop this," Daruk said, her voice barely a whisper as she faced the rest of the team. "We can't let it control us." The voice spoke again, closer now, as though it was circling them, lingering in the shadows. "You are weak, just as they were, just as you will always be." It was a challenge, a provocation, and before Daruk could stop them, the crew surged forward again, driven by the very rage they had been trying to escape. With a flash of realization, Daruk understood the terrible truth. The Rageborn weren't just a species, they were an infection, a plague that spread not through physical means, but through emotions. They didn't need to fight humanity. They could manipulate humanity's deepest fears and darkest impulses, turning everyone against themselves. And if they weren't stopped now, the Rageborn would have more than just a single planet to conquer. They would have the entire galaxy. The tension in the temple was unbearable now. The very air crackled with malignant energy. Thick with rage and fear, the crew was on the brink of complete collapse. Each person gripped by an uncontrollable urge to lash out, to fight, to destroy. Daruk's heart pounded in her chest as she struggled to hold on to her sanity. She could see the wild look in their eyes, the unreasoning aggression taking hold of them. And she knew that if they couldn't control themselves, there would be no stopping the Rageborn. The cold, hollow voice of the Rageborn echoed again through the temple, its cadence deliberate, mocking. "You are nothing but pawns in a game you don't understand." The walls around them seemed to shift, to pulse, as if reacting to the anger in the room. The vibrations increased, reverberating through Daruk's very bones, threatening to tear her apart from the inside out. She could feel the grip of the Rageborn tightening, manipulating her thoughts, her emotions. But she had come too far to succumb to it now. She had seen the history, the destruction they had caused, and she couldn't let that happen again. "Listen to me," Daruk shouted, her voice breaking through the chaos. "The madness. We're being manipulated. They're feeding off our anger. We have to fight it, or we'll become like them. Just another weapon in their hands." For a moment, there was silence. The crew seemed to hesitate, as if they were hearing her through the fog of their rage. Then, slowly, some of them began to pull back, shaking their heads as though trying to clear the haze in their minds. It wasn't enough, though the Rageborn's power was too strong, and the planet itself was alive with it. The ground trembled beneath their feet, and the darkness in the temple deepened, swallowing the light of their flashlights. Suddenly, the stone walls of the temple began to crack, the air growing colder as a deep, low rumble emanated from the depths of the structure. It was as though something was awakening beneath their feet, something ancient and powerful, stirred by the conflict around them. "No," Daruk whispered, her breath quickening as she looked around. Trying to make sense of what was happening, the vibrations grew stronger, and the entire temple seemed to shift, as though it was alive, responding to their presence. Then, from the shadows, figures began to emerge, tall and gaunt, their forms indistinct, and shadowed. Their movements were fluid and unnatural, like the very air had taken shape and come to life. These were the Rageborn, no longer hidden, no longer dormant, but now standing before them, their presence suffocating. They didn't look like anything Dr. Rook had expected. They were not the physical beasts of destruction she had imagined. They were something far more unsettling. They were emotion incarnate, beings made of raw, twisted rage that clung to the air like an unbearable weight. A single figure stepped forward from the shadows, its glowing eyes fixed on the crew, its voice seeping into their minds like a cold whisper. "You have come to challenge us. But it is futile. Your anger will consume you as it always has." The Rageborn didn't need to speak aloud. They could communicate directly through thoughts, through emotions, stirring up their deepest fears and desires. But Dr. Rook had seen their power firsthand. She had felt their influence spreading like wildfire through the crew, pushing them toward violence, toward the brink of madness. "Fight it," she urged, though her voice felt weak, drowned in the overwhelming presence of the Rageborn. "We cannot let them take us." But her words were drowned out by the collective fury of the crew, their emotions spiraling out of control once again. The Rageborn were feeding off it, amplifying it, until the crew was nothing more than a mass of violence and hatred. Daruk stepped back, her own body trembling with the effort to stay focused. She had to find a way to stop them. There had to be something. Some way to break the hold of the Rageborn. She couldn't lose herself now, not after everything. And then, as if in response to her thoughts, a figure emerged from the darkness behind the Rageborn, the form of a woman, standing tall, her eyes glowing with the same unnatural light. "You cannot resist," the woman spoke, her voice cold but tinged with a strange compassion. "It is in your nature to succumb to rage, to destruction. We have always been here, always waiting." Daruk's blood ran cold as the figure's words washed over her. She had to find a way to break the cycle, to shut the Rageborn down before they could truly awaken again, before they could begin to reignite the fire of destruction across the galaxy. Daruk's heart hammered in her chest, her mind racing to keep pace with the shifting reality around her. The Rageborn were real, tangible, alive, standing before her in all their terrifying power, and with them, the oppressive force that had clouded her mind, twisted her thoughts, was stronger than ever. The woman, the Rageborn, spoke again, her words cutting through the chaos, each syllable a knife aimed directly at the core of Daruk's will. "You cannot fight us, human." The voice was calm, chilling, as though the Rageborn already knew everything about her, her fears, her weaknesses, her history. "You are no different from those who came before you, those who succumbed to our power, to the rage that runs deep in your blood." Daruk could feel her resolve crumbling under the weight of those words. The urge to lash out, to release the violent energy building inside her, was almost unbearable, but she couldn't give in. She knew that the moment she let her emotions take over, the Rageborn would win, and humanity would be lost. The crew around her was still struggling, caught in the grips of the same overwhelming emotion, their minds lost in a haze of anger and fear. Daruk fought back the tears that threatened to overwhelm her, forcing herself to breathe, to think. She turned toward the rest of the team, her voice trembling but firm. "Listen to me," she cried. "This is what they want. They're using our emotions, using our rage to control us. We have to break free. We can't let them win." For a brief moment, there was a flicker of recognition in the eyes of the crew, a glimmer of humanity breaking through the haze of their anger. But it wasn't enough. The Rageborn's influence was too powerful, and their rage was still too raw, too deep. "Your fight is hopeless." Dr. Rook, the woman, spoke again, her gaze fixed on the scientist with a mixture of pity and disdain. "You are all too fragile, too easily swayed by the emotions you claim to control. We are your past, your future, and your downfall. You will never escape this." But Rook wasn't listening anymore. She had seen enough. She had come too far to let it end like this. She knew that if humanity was going to survive, they had to understand the true nature of the Rageborn, what they truly were. The Rageborn weren't just beings of raw emotion. They were a reflection of the darkest parts of sentient beings, born from a primal need to feed on anger and fear. They were not invincible, not all-powerful, but they thrived on chaos, on the uncontrolled fury of those around them. Rook's mind sharpened as the realization hit her. She turned, searching frantically for something, anything, inside the temple that might give her the edge she needed. And then she saw it, the altar at the center of the temple, its surface covered in strange symbols glowing faintly in the dark. The symbols seemed to pulse with the same energy that had been spreading through the crew, amplifying their emotions. The Rageborn had used this place to bind their power to the very fabric of the planet, using it as a conduit to influence the galaxy. If she could sever that connection, disrupt the flow of energy between the Rageborn and the planet, maybe, just maybe, she could break their hold. Everyone, get to the altar. Rook shouted, her voice more forceful than it had been in hours. We have to destroy it, or they'll control us all. The crew hesitated for a moment, the pull of the Rageborn's influence still heavy on their minds. But slowly, with difficulty, they began to move toward the altar, their steps faltering as the anger threatened to tear them apart. The woman, the Rageborn, raised a hand, and a low growl of fury echoed from deep within the temple. You think you can destroy what has existed for eons? You think you can erase the foundation of your own darkness? But Rook had no time to argue. She reached the altar first, her fingers brushing the cold surface as the symbols flared to life beneath her touch. She could feel the power surging through her, the rage threatening to consume her, but she pushed through it with every ounce of strength she had left. With a cry, she slammed her fist into the altar, sending a shockwave of energy rippling through the temple. The symbols shattered, their glow dimming as the connection between the Rageborn and the planet was severed. The temple shook, its walls groaning in protest as the energy collapsed in on itself. The Rageborn screamed, their forms flickering as if the very essence of their existence was unraveling. But even as they disintegrated, Rook knew that this was just the beginning. The Rageborn might be gone from this place, but their power still lingered in the galaxy, a dormant seed waiting to take root again. And humanity would have to be ready.